She laughed at the human soldier, until he gave a command that changed everything. The training field was hot and dusty. Alien girls stood in a straight line, their colorful armor shining under the twin suns. They were part of the Royal Defense Squad, but they were not very serious. Most of them were spoiled daughters of high-ranking alien families. They were not used to rules. At the center of them stood one girl, Tixia. She was the boldest, the loudest, and the most beautiful. Her purple skin shimmered when she moved. Her eyes sparkled with trouble. She had never obeyed anyone in her life, especially not a human. "Where is he?" she asked with a smirk. "This so-called discipline trainer." The others giggled. They had heard that a human soldier had been assigned to train them. A male. From Earth. What could he possibly teach them? Just then, the gate opened. A tall man walked in, wearing black armor and calm eyes. He had a clean face, short hair, and a strong build. His name was Corvin. He said nothing at first. He just looked at them, quiet, serious, and still. Tixia yawned loudly. "You're the trainer," she said. "You look soft." Corvin turned to her, his expression calm. "Name?" he asked. She smiled with fake sweetness. "Tixia, daughter of the great counselor of Zern." He nodded. "Then, Tixia, step forward." She did, with confidence, with pride. She even winked at the girls behind her. "I will make this simple," Corvin said. "You are here to learn discipline, focus, and control. If you laugh, joke, or disobey, there will be consequences." Tixia raised an eyebrow. "Consequences? Like what?" "Push-ups. Boring talks." Corvin looked straight into her eyes. "No, you'll join me for private training." The group gasped. Private training. That had never happened before. Tixia laughed loudly. "Oh no." Alone with this scary human. She placed a hand on her chest, mocking him. "Whatever shall I do?" Corvin did not smile. "Report to the Dark Hall in 1 hour. Wear standard gear. No weapons." Before she could reply, he walked away. 1 hour later, Tixia entered the Dark Hall. It was quiet, cold. The walls were smooth metal, and there were no windows. Just one door. It locked behind her. Corvin stood in the center, arms behind his back. "You came," he said. "Of course," Tixia said, smiling. "I was curious. What kind of punishment does a human give?" "This is not punishment," Corvin replied. "This is correction." She tilted her head. "Sounds the same to me." He didn't respond. He threw a wooden staff at her feet. "Pick it up." Tixia looked at it, then at him. "You want me to fight you?" "No," he said. "I want you to learn. But if you want to fight, go ahead." She picked up the staff. She moved fast, spinning it, showing off her alien combat moves. She had trained in elite schools. She was fast and flexible. She struck toward him. Corvin moved only once. Tixia found herself on the floor. The staff was gone from her hands. She blinked. What just happened?" "You attacked without discipline," Corvin said calmly. "You moved with ego, not skill." She stood up, angry now. "You cheated." Corvin stepped forward, his voice low. "I don't need to cheat. You're strong, but careless. Powerful, but lazy. You think beauty and jokes will protect you in war." Tixia was breathing heavily. She had never been spoken to like this. He threw the staff back to her. Again. She picked it up. This time, she moved slower, focused. They fought, not with anger, but with sharp, controlled moves. Every time she made a mistake, Corvin corrected her. His words were few, but clear. "Lower your arm. Watch your feet. Use your core, not your pride." Minutes turned into an hour. Tixia was sweating now. Her heart raced, not just from the training, but from something else. Respect. For the first time, she wasn't laughing. When she dropped the staff and sat down, Corvin offered her water. She looked up at him, confused. "Why are you doing this?" "To make you better," he said simply, "because one day your life may depend on it." Tixia took the water. She didn't speak. But inside, she was no longer mocking the human. She was wondering what else he could teach her. She thought he was weak, but his hands made her body betray her. The next morning, Tixia couldn't stop thinking about the training. Her arms ached. Her legs burned, but something deeper inside her was awake. She had faced many trainers before, some loud, some cruel, some even charming. But Corvin was different. He didn't shout. He didn't flirt. He didn't care about her title, her beauty, or her background. He saw through it all. And for the first time in her life, she had listened. Tixia stood in front of the mirror in her private chamber. She touched her face. Her skin had changed color slightly during the night, a soft glow of silver near her neck. On her planet, that color meant confusion mixed with attraction. She frowned. It wasn't supposed to happen. "Stupid body," she whispered. She dressed quickly in standard training gear and rushed out, trying to shake the thoughts away. When she reached the training field, the other alien girls were already lined up. They were laughing, chatting, still not taking anything seriously. A few turned to Tixia. "Ooh," one of them teased. "Look who survived private training." "Did he cry?" Another joked. "Or did you?" Tixia didn't respond. She just stood still, quiet. That made them even more curious. Tixia, silent. Corvin walked in. His armor was plain, but something about the way he moved made them all quiet down. He nodded at the group. "We begin with basic stance. Line up, feet apart, breathe deep." The girls moved lazily. Some rolled their eyes, but Tixia followed each command perfectly. Corvin noticed. He walked behind the group, observing. He stopped behind Tixia. "Better," he said. Her body tensed at the sound of his voice. Not from fear, but something else. "Control your breathing," he added softly. "Don't let your body rule your mind." She exhaled slowly, following him without question. Later, the group moved to the sparring circle. 2 girls at a time would step forward and train. Tixia stepped in, waiting for a partner. But Corvin surprised her. He walked into the circle himself. "You'll spar with me," he said. Gasps filled the air. Tixia's heart skipped. "Me?" Again. Corvin nodded. This time, without weapons. Her face turned hot. No weapons meant close contact. Skin to skin. Alien customs were strict. Touch between species wasn't forbidden, but it wasn't encouraged. Especially not in public. "Scared?" he asked. That one word flipped a switch in her. She stepped forward. "Never." The match began. Tixia lunged with grace, her movements fluid. Corvin countered every step with calm power. She spun, kicked, blocked. He caught her wrist, turned her gently but firmly. Their hands touched. Her skin pulsed with light. Silver, then a faint blue. She panicked. Her body was reacting to him. Openly. Visibly. She pushed harder, hoping to distract herself. But Corvin's strength was controlled, not forceful. Every time she moved, he guided. Every time she twisted, he redirected. And when he held her arms to stop a strike, her knees nearly gave out. Their faces were close. She could feel his breath. Calm. Unshaken. He whispered, "You're fighting yourself, not me." That broke her. She stepped back, chest rising and falling. "I can't focus," she admitted. "Not around you." Corvin lowered his arms. "Then it's time you learn how to control more than just your body." That evening, Tixia didn't return to her private chamber. She sat alone under the glowing tree lights outside the training camp, watching the stars. Her fingers still tingled where he had touched her. No man had ever touched her like that. Not with desire, but with purpose. not to control her, but to guide her. She didn't understand what was happening to her. That's when she heard footsteps. She turned quickly, hand on her dagger, then stopped. It was Corvin. He sat beside her without a word. The silence was peaceful. After a moment, she spoke. "What are you?" He raised an eyebrow. "A human." "No," she said. "You're different. You don't act like the others. You don't flirt. You don't try to impress. You make me feel." She trailed off. Corvin looked at her carefully. "You feel out of control. And that scares you." She nodded. He continued. "Your people are taught to control everything. Emotions, thoughts, body reactions, but discipline isn't about control. It's about balance." He took her hand gently. "Your skin is glowing. It means something. Don't hide it. Understand it." She stared at their joined hands. Her skin shimmered between blue and silver. She whispered, "It's never glowed like this before." Corvin leaned closer. "Then maybe you're not the same anymore." The next day, everything changed. Tixia walked into training like a new person. Stronger, focused, but something soft had entered her eyes. She still defied small things, refused to tie her hair, smirked during exercises, but it wasn't mockery anymore. It was play. The other girls noticed. "What happened to you?" one asked. Tixia smiled. "I stopped laughing at the human. Now, I'm listening to him." That afternoon, Corvin called her again, for another private session. This time, she didn't roll her eyes. She followed him quietly. Inside the hall, Corvin placed 2 staffs on the ground. "Same rules," he said. "But today, you lead." Tixia blinked. "I lead. You'll teach me how you fight, and I'll show you how to improve it." They trained for hours, side by side. Not enemies, not teacher and student. Something else. Every time their hands touched, Tixia's skin lit with soft colors. Corvin didn't mention it. He didn't pull away. And neither did she. By the end, she sat beside him, panting. "I used to think you were weak," she admitted. He looked at her. "And now?" he asked. She smiled, brushing her hair back. "Now I think you're dangerous. Dangerous. Because you make my heart beat in ways I can't control." Corvin didn't smile, but his eyes said everything. Her friends set a trap, but he turned it into her deepest lesson. Tixia walked into the morning training field with her head held high. But this time, she wasn't smiling to mock anyone. Something in her had changed. Her movements were sharper. Her balance was perfect. Her face still held pride. But it was the right kind now. Pride in herself, not in her status. But not everyone liked this new Tixia. 3 of her closest friends, Zalexa, Nurin, and Meir, watched from the sidelines. They whispered to each other, jealous and annoyed. "She used to be our leader," Zalexa hissed. "Now she's acting like a little student," Nurin added. Meir narrowed her glowing yellow eyes. "She's letting that human control her." "He's not even one of us," Zalexa snapped. "Just a male. From Earth." The 3 alien girls hated how Tixia kept choosing Corvin's side. To them, she was supposed to be untouchable, royal, above discipline. "She needs to remember who she is," Zalexa said. "Or who we are." That evening, while Tixia rested under the moonflower tree, the 3 girls approached her. "Tixia," Zalexa said sweetly, "we want to talk." Tixia looked up with a calm smile. "Go ahead." "We think Corvin is hiding something," Meir said. Tixia raised an eyebrow. "Like what?" "Like how he always disappears at night," Zalexa said. "He sneaks out of the base, alone." Tixia frowned. She hadn't noticed that. "Maybe," Nurin whispered, "he's meeting with spies. Maybe he's not even a real trainer." Tixia stood up slowly. "He's not like that." Zalexa touched her shoulder. "Then come with us tonight. We'll follow him. See the truth." Tixia hesitated. A small doubt crept into her mind. Corvin never talked about his past, never smiled, never showed anger or fear. Where did he go at night? That night, the four girls followed Corvin in secret. He left the base quietly, walking across the sand plains toward the old stone arena, an abandoned alien combat ground no longer in use. They hid behind rocks, watching. "Let's trap him inside," Zalexa whispered. "We'll lock the gates and scare him. Maybe he'll run. Maybe we'll finally see his real face." Tixia didn't like the idea, but part of her was still curious. Before she could stop them, the girls activated the gate lock. The large stone doors shut behind Corvin with a deep boom. The arena lights flickered on. Inside, he stood still, calm as always. Then he spoke. "I know you're there." The girls froze. His voice echoed. "You think I'm blind? I felt you following me the moment you stepped out of the camp." He turned to face the shadows. "Come in, all of you." Tixia looked at the others. Zalexa shook her head. "No way. It's a trap." But Tixia stepped forward. She walked into the arena. The lights grew brighter. Corvin stood at the center, next to a table filled with strange devices. "This," he said quietly, "was supposed to be your next test." Tixia blinked. "Test?" He nodded. "Real fear, real survival, not fake drills." He pressed a button. The arena ground began to shift. Metal plates moved. A low growl echoed from the other side. Tixia's heart jumped. Something was coming. From the shadows, a creature appeared, half robotic, half beast. It had no eyes, only sensors. It could smell fear. It moved slowly, searching. "Corvin, what is that?" Tixia asked, her voice shaking. "A creature designed to test focus," he replied. "It won't attack unless you panic." The beast sniffed the air. Its claws scratched the stone. Tixia tried to stay still. Her breathing grew fast. Corvin placed a hand on her shoulder. "Breathe. Focus. You're stronger than your fear." But her skin betrayed her. It shimmered dark purple, the color of fear. The creature hissed and charged. Tixia screamed. Corvin moved faster than she could see. In one motion, he threw her behind him and stood tall. The creature lunged. He dodged, rolled, and pressed a control device on its back. The beast froze, then powered down. Silence filled the arena. Tixia lay on the ground, gasping. Corvin turned to her. His voice was cold. "You let fear win." She looked up at him with shame. "I wasn't ready." "No one is," he said. "Not the first time." She sat up, her eyes wide. "Why? Why do this?" He knelt beside her. "Because your real enemies won't care about your title, your jokes, or your beauty. They'll only care if you're weak." Tixia looked down. "I'm sorry," she whispered. He stood up. "Then prove you've learned. Come back tomorrow." Alone. He walked away, leaving her in silence. Back at camp, the three girls waited. "Well?" Zalexa asked. "Did he cry?" Tixia didn't smile. She didn't say anything. She walked past them without a word. That night, she didn't sleep. The next morning, Tixia returned to the arena. Corvin was already waiting. This time, the creature was gone. Just a single wooden staff stood in the center. He looked at her. "Today, you'll face yourself." She nodded. They trained in silence. Every hit had purpose. Every movement was clean. When she lost balance, she didn't whine. She corrected it. She didn't ask for praise. And that's when Corvin gave it. "You've changed," he said. She lowered her staff. "Because you didn't treat me like a child." He nodded. "I treated you like a warrior." She looked up. "Am I one now?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached forward and wiped sweat from her cheek. Her skin flared silver and pink. She didn't pull away. Neither did he. "You're becoming something more," Corvin whispered. "Not just a warrior. Not just a student. Her voice trembled. Then what am I? He looked into her eyes. You're becoming mine. Her species banned physical contact. Now she can't stop craving his touch. Tixia woke up before the twin suns rose. Her bed felt too cold. Her body felt too warm. She touched her face and saw the soft, glowing silver color on her neck and hands again. Her heart beat faster. This was not normal. She stood in front of the mirror, afraid of what she was becoming. On her planet, Zern, physical contact with another species, especially a human, was dangerous. Not just for society, but for the body itself. Alien females of her kind were sensitive. If they made too much physical contact with someone they deeply respected or felt attracted to, their body began to bond. Not emotionally, biologically. Once it started, it could not be undone. Tixia had only read about it in old scrolls. Her elders warned young girls like her, do not let your body betray your future. Respect is fine. Obedience is fine. But touch leads to change. And now, she couldn't stop thinking about his hands. In training, she avoided Corvin's eyes. She followed every command. She moved like a shadow, fast and clean. She hit her marks. She didn't speak. But inside, her body was burning. Every time he walked past her, she could smell his scent. Clean, strong, like iron and earth. Her fingers twitched, remembering the feel of his skin when he wiped her cheek. She told herself it was just training, just discipline, just a bond between teacher and student. But she was lying. Later that day, she hid in the meditation room. It was quiet, filled with light blue crystals that glowed with calm energy. She knelt, trying to slow her heart, to cool her body. But nothing helped. That's when a soft voice entered. You're running again. She turned around fast. Corvin stood at the doorway. Tixia looked away. I needed silence. You're not afraid of silence, he said, walking in. You're afraid of what it's saying to you. She stood up. I'm not scared. You're glowing. She looked at her hands, light pink and silver. She cursed under her breath. Corvin stepped closer. You're reacting. I know what it means. I studied your people before coming here. Her voice cracked. Then you know it's forbidden. I know it, he said, but I didn't touch you with desire. I touched you with care, with respect. That's worse, she whispered, because now I want more. Corvin stared at her, silent. She stepped closer. Do you feel it too? He didn't speak. She took his hand. Her fingers wrapped around his palm. The color on her body deepened. The heat spread. Her breathing became heavy. Corvin pulled his hand away. We can't, he said. Why? She asked. Because I'm alien. Because I'm your trainer, he replied. But not forever. He turned away. This isn't about love or want. This is biology. Your body is bonding. You can't control it. She reached for him again. Then don't let go. He froze. Her voice softened. Please. That night, the head elder called Tixia to the council chamber. The other girls had talked. They had seen the color changes. They had whispered. And someone had reported her. Tixia stood in the center of the room, facing 5 glowing alien elders. One spoke in a deep voice. You are showing signs of physical reaction. Are you bonding with the human trainer? She didn't answer. Tixia, another said, if you do not break this now, your body will complete the change. You will never be the same. She looked up. I already feel different. That is not growth. That is corruption. She took a breath. No, that is strength. I've never trained like this before. Never focused like this. Never wanted to become better. The oldest elder leaned forward. Then you will go through the purity trial. If you pass, your connection will break. And if I fail, she asked, you will be cast out, marked, alien even to your own kind. Tixia closed her eyes. She saw Corvin's face in her mind. His calm eyes, his steady hands, his voice in the dark arena. She opened her eyes. I accept the trial. The purity trial began at midnight. Tixia stood inside a cold, black chamber. A glowing orb floated above her head. It would draw out her emotions. If she had feelings, or a biological bond, it would show. Pain would follow. A lot of pain. She gritted her teeth. The orb pulsed. Memories rushed into her mind. Corvin's voice. You're not running from me. You're running from yourself. His hands guiding her stance, his eyes watching her with silent belief. Her skin burned. Her body trembled. But she refused to cry. Until a voice echoed in her head. His voice. Calm, deep, firm. You're mine. Her knees gave out. She screamed. The orb burst into light. At that exact moment, Corvin woke from sleep. Something was wrong. He didn't wait for permission. He ran straight to the council chambers. When he saw Tixia lying in the dark, barely breathing, glowing all over, his heart stopped. He rushed to her side. The elders stepped forward. She failed. She's bonded. Corvin looked at them. Then punish me. They stared at him. She bonded because I touched her, he said. Because I respected her. Because I trained her not just to obey, but to believe in herself. One elder whispered, do you accept her as your responsibility? He didn't hesitate. Yes. Tixia opened her eyes slowly. Her vision blurred, then cleared. She saw him, kneeling beside her, holding her hand. Her skin glowed bright crystal pink. I failed, she whispered. No, Corvin said softly. You passed, just not their test. Her lips trembled. Then what happens now? He smiled, the smallest smile. Now, you're no longer my student. She smiled back, weak but true. Good, she whispered. Because now I don't want training. I want you. She tried to run from him, but the bond was already complete. The stars over Zern blinked like cold fire. Tixia stood at the edge of the cliffs, wind pulling at her dark training robe. Her eyes were red. Her body still shimmered with soft pink tones, revealing her connection to Corvin. The bond was complete. She could feel it now. Even though no one had spoken the words, her body knew. Her soul knew. And it terrified her. She had grown up believing she would be untouchable, that her future was her own to shape, that she could laugh at rules, bend the world around her. But now, her emotions were tied to a man from another world. A human, a soldier, her trainer, and she had no control over what came next. Down below in the training camp, Corvin searched for her. She hadn't come to class. She hadn't answered her comm signal. Her room was empty. He asked the other girls. None had seen her since last night's purity trial. Where would she go? Corvin asked himself aloud. Then he remembered her favorite place, the cliffs, where the winds sang secrets and the stars felt close. When he found her, she didn't turn to look at him. She just stood there, arms crossed, the breeze wrapping around her like a quiet storm. You found me, she said softly. I always will, Corvin replied. Tixia shut her eyes, fighting tears. This isn't how I wanted things to go, she whispered. I didn't plan for this. I didn't either, he said. But it happened. And it's real. I don't know who I am anymore, she confessed. I was strong, independent. Now I'm connected to you. I feel you even when you're not near. I can't sleep. I can't focus. She turned to him finally. And worst of all, I don't want it to stop. Corvin stepped closer. You're not weak, he said. You've become more powerful than ever. Then why do I feel so broken inside? She asked. Because you're trying to fight something that isn't your enemy. He reached out and touched her cheek gently. Her skin lit up, pink and silver. Her breath caught. I don't want to be a bondmate, she whispered. I want to be free. You are free, he said. This bond didn't trap you. It revealed you. Tixia shook her head. They'll never accept it. The elders, my people, they already see me as a traitor. Then come with me, Corvin said, voice low. Leave the council. Leave the rules. Come to Earth. Tixia stepped back, heart racing. Run away? She asked. No, Corvin said. Run toward something better. That night, she didn't sleep. She walked the training halls alone. Everywhere she turned, she saw memories. The first time she mocked Corvin. The day she was defeated. The arena fight. The bond. Her heart was torn in two. Could she really leave everything behind? Her people. Her title. Her old self. At sunrise, she made her choice. She packed only one bag. She left a note behind for the council. I cannot serve both your rules and my truth. I choose truth. And then, she ran. But what Tixia didn't know was that her bond with Corvin had reached the final stage. Even from miles away, he could feel her emotions, her fear, her panic, her pain. And suddenly, he felt something else. Danger. Tixia moved quickly through the forest lands of Zern, heading toward the old spaceport. She knew a traitor there who could help her leave the planet in secret. But halfway through the path, she heard something behind her. A whisper. A step. A growl. She turned. A wild beast from the deep jungles, a Velcro, stood between her and the exit path. 7 feet tall. Muscular. Hungry. She backed away slowly. But the creature lunged. She ran. Corvin woke in a cold sweat. Tixia, he whispered. Without thinking, he grabbed his weapon and jumped on a hoverbike. He didn't need a tracker. The bond led him. Tixia ran as fast as she could, ducking through trees, leaping over roots. The Velcro chased her, roaring, slashing. One strike hit her leg. She fell, rolling across the ground. Blood stained her clothes. The beast stepped closer, growling. Tixia tried to crawl away, but her body was weak. She closed her eyes and whispered, Corvin. A loud blast shook the ground. The Velcro turned. Another blast. Then a beam of light hit the beast's side. The creature howled and ran back into the trees. Tixia opened her eyes. Through the dust and light, Corvin appeared. He rushed to her side. She tried to sit up. How did you find me? He smiled faintly. You called me. I did, she whispered. He touched her face gently. You didn't use words, but I felt you. He carried her back through the forest, one arm under her legs, the other over her back. I tried to run from you, she said quietly. I know. I thought it would protect you. Corvin looked at her, eyes deep and serious. You don't protect someone by leaving them, he said. You protect them by standing with them. She laid her head against his chest. And if your people reject you, she asked. Then they were never mine to begin with, he said. But you're mine. They returned to the base just before night. The girls were waiting. So were the elders. Tixia stood, still weak, but tall. I ran, she told them, because I was afraid of what I felt. But not anymore. I'm not ashamed of the bond, she said. I'm proud of it. The elders didn't speak at first. Then one of them, an old female, walked forward. She stared hard at Tixia, then at Corvin. She placed her hand on Tixia's head and whispered, Then be proud. But be ready. Love like this changes everything. Later that night, Tixia and Corvin stood alone beneath the moon. She reached for his hand. He took it. Her skin glowed once again. But this time, she didn't hide it. Her people want her purified. But she only wants the human. The air inside the grand hall was cold and still. The walls glowed with sacred blue light. Alien elders, warriors, and nobles sat in silence, their faces tight with judgment. This place had seen royal ceremonies, ancient duels, and sacred oaths, but never something like this. In the center stood Tixia, her head held high, her skin glowing a mix of silver and deep pink. She wore no armor now, just a plain white robe. Her hands were tied in front of her, not by ropes, but by honor. She had chosen to return. She had chosen to face them. The High Elder stood. "Tixia of Zern," she said loudly, "you were once the daughter of pride, a fighter, a leader among our youth." Tixia didn't move. "But now you return with a forbidden bond," the Elder continued. "You connected with an outsider, a human. You allowed your body and soul to shift. You let emotion conquer duty." Tixia looked into the eyes of the Elder. "And for the first time," she said clearly, "I feel alive." Gasps filled the hall. The Elders narrowed their eyes. Another stood up. "Then you know what must be done." Tixia nodded. "Yes, the severing ritual." Corvin watched from the far side of the hall, guarded by 4 elite alien warriors. He was not allowed to stand by her. He was a guest, a danger, an outsider. But his eyes never left her, and hers never left him. The severing ritual was old, used only in rare cases. It pulled the emotional energy from a bonded pair. It wiped away the feelings, the heat, the connection. It made the heart forget. Tixia was led to the center altar. A glowing orb hovered above her, just like during the purity trial. But this time, it was worse. This orb didn't just search for feelings. It crushed them. Elder Vera stepped forward with a staff. "If you go through with this, your bond will die. Your feelings will fade. You will return to what you were." Tixia looked up at the orb. Then she looked at Corvin. She saw his calm face, his steady breath. But in his eyes was pain. She stepped back. "No," she said softly. "I don't want this." The crowd murmured. "You must," the Elder said. "I already passed the trial." Tixia replied. "You can't force me again." "This is not for you," another Elder snapped. "It's for your people, for your planet, for our bloodline." Tixia turned to face everyone. "I was once your future," she said. "I trained here. I studied here. I even led some of you into battle drills." She paused. "But none of you truly saw me. You saw my name, my title, my rank." Her voice shook with power now. "But he saw me, the human you call weak. He looked at me like I was worth saving, worth teaching, worth touching." She walked toward Corvin, pushing past the guards. "You want to erase this," she said loudly, pointing to the color glowing on her skin. "You want to delete what makes me feel human, alive." She reached Corvin and took his hand. The hall gasped. The guards stepped forward, but the Elders raised their hands. No one moved. Tixia's skin glowed bright, more radiant than ever before. Silver, pink, the hint of red. The Elder said, "The bond has entered its final form." Tixia turned to the council. "Then you can't break it, not without killing me." Silence fell. Elder Vera stepped down from the platform, her face unreadable. She walked slowly toward Tixia. "What if you're wrong? What if this love burns away? What if this bond fails?" Tixia held Corvin's hand tighter. "Then I would rather fall with him than rise without him." A long silence followed. The Elders whispered among themselves. Some shook their heads. Some nodded slowly. And then the High Elder finally stood. "Then so be it." Gasps echoed. "You have made your choice," she said. "You will not be purified. You will not be erased. But know this." She raised her staff high. "You are no longer of Zern. Your bloodline ends here. Your name is removed from our books." Tixia bowed her head. "I understand." Corvin stepped forward. He wrapped his arms around her. For the first time, in front of all of Zern, they embraced. A simple touch, but a powerful one. The light from her skin flowed onto his arms, wrapping him in color. and slowly his own body began to glow back. Not bright, not wild, but a quiet pulse of silver on his chest. The elders saw it. The room held its breath. A human was glowing, bonded, accepted by her energy. Outside the grand hall, warriors, workers, and even children had gathered. They watched the glowing couple exit. Some turned away. Some clapped quietly. Some fell to their knees. Change had come to Zern. Not by war, not by power, but by the soft, stubborn, quiet touch of love. That night, Tixia stood with Corvin at the edge of the same cliff where she once tried to run. Now she leaned against his chest. "You lost your place," he whispered. "I found a better one," she replied. "Are you sure?" he asked. She smiled. "I'm not your student anymore." "No," he agreed. "You're mine." The naughty alien girl is gone. Now she's the human's loyal mate. The training grounds look different now. Not because the buildings had changed, but because the energy had. There was more silence, more discipline, more focus, and at the center of it all stood a figure no one expected. Tixia, once known as the proud, wild, and disobedient daughter of Zern's high families, she was now something far greater, a commander in her own right. And beside her, always steady, always silent, was the man who changed everything. Corvin, the human. A new batch of young alien recruits stood before them. They whispered quietly, stealing glances. "That's the girl who defied the council," one muttered. "She touched a human and survived," said another. "No," another corrected softly. "She didn't just survive. She became stronger." Tixia stepped forward, her cloak blowing in the wind. Her skin glowed faint pink and silver, but it was no longer shocking. It was respected. "Do you know why you're here?" she asked. None of the new recruits answered. Corvin walked to her side. His voice was low and steady. "You're here because you think strength comes from power." Tixia continued, "But real strength comes from truth." One recruit finally raised a hand. "Truth." Tixia nodded. "The truth of who you are, the truth of what you fear, and the truth of who you're willing to stand beside." She turned to Corvin and took his hand. "Our bond was forbidden. It cost us our homes, our titles, even our bloodline. But it gave us something greater." Corvin looked at the recruits. Purpose, peace, and a reason to keep fighting. Later that evening, Tixia sat under the glowing moon tree, a spot that once brought her confusion. Now it brought her peace. Corvin sat beside her, sharpening a blade. She watched him in silence, then smiled. "Do you remember when I first met you? You laughed at me," Corvin said without looking up. "And you said I volunteered for private training," she replied, chuckling. "You looked like you were going to eat me alive." She laughed again, her voice soft. "I almost did." Corvin finally smiled. "But you didn't." "No," she said, resting her head on his shoulder. "Because for the first time, someone saw me." He put his arm around her. "I still do." Word of their bond had spread far beyond the Zern Council. Across planets, other alien tribes began to question their own rules. Young girls whispered of Tixia's courage. Some even wrote letters asking for her training. Others asked about love, about bonding, about hope. Tixia didn't answer all of them. She didn't need to. Her story was now part of something larger. One night, as rain fell soft over the mountains, Tixia woke suddenly. Her skin pulsed a strange purple. Not fear, but something else. She sat up, hand on her stomach. "Corvin," she whispered. He woke, instantly alert. "What is it?" She took his hand and placed it on her belly. A soft pulse. Not hers. Not his. Another. Weeks passed. The camp remained quiet. But inside their chamber, something new was growing. Life. Tixia had feared her bond would make her less. But now it was giving her more than she ever imagined. One evening, she called the entire camp to the training field. The sun was setting. The sky glowed gold and violet. The recruits stood in full armor, confused but ready. Corvin stood by Tixia as she stepped forward. "I was once called naughty," she began. "Undisciplined, rebellious." She looked over the field. And maybe I was. But I was also searching. For meaning. For strength. For someone who wouldn't try to tame me, but train me. She took Corvin's hand. "This man never shouted at me. He never forced me to change. He let me choose my path, and walked beside me." Corvin nodded. She became strong not because I controlled her, but because she believed in herself. Tixia turned to the recruits. "You are here to train, but not just your body. You must train your hearts, your minds, your truths." She smiled. "And maybe, if you're lucky, you'll find someone who makes you better, just by standing beside you." That night, around the campfire, Tixia told her full story for the first time. From her first laugh, to the private training room, to the trap in the arena, the failed purity trial, the severing ritual, and the moment she whispered Corvin's name while bleeding in the forest. The recruits listened without blinking. Some cried. Some nodded. All of them remembered. Tixia finished with a soft smile. "I thought I was losing everything. But I wasn't. I was being shaped, refined, awakened." She turned to Corvin. "I was naughty," she whispered. He smirked. "You still are." She laughed. "Maybe, but now I'm yours." "And I'm yours," he said, placing a hand over her glowing skin. Days turned into months. The camp grew. More alien females arrived, strong, stubborn, curious, ready to be trained. Tixia stood at the front of every class. Corvin stood beside her. They were more than trainers now. They were symbols, proof that love was not weakness, that bonds were not shameful, that strength could come from softness, that even a naughty alien girl could become a legend. Years later, on a planet far away, a little girl with soft silver and pink skin walked into her first training session. Her eyes sparkled. Her laugh echoed in the wind. The trainer smiled at her and asked, "What's your name, little one?" She stood tall and proud. "My name is Aurin," she said, "daughter of Tixia and Corvin." "And why are you here?" The girl smiled wide. "To become strong like my mom, and wise like my dad." And somewhere, high above, the stars of Zern glowed quietly, not in judgment, but in peace.